The storm had already swallowed the Austin skyline by the time the clock glowed 9:14 on my kitchen stove, its blue light flickering against the glass windows that wrapped around my penthouse. Rain hammered the balcony rail like a fist, steady and angry, and the wind pressed against the panes as if it wanted in. I stood barefoot on the cool, hardwood floor, still in my work clothes, a light blue blouse and dark slacks, trying to unwind after a grueling day of project meetings. I had expected nothing more dramatic than a cup of tea and the sound of rain. Instead, the elevator chimed, the front door flew open, and the three people who had shaped my entire life, for better or worse, stumbled inside in a cloud of alcohol fumes and misplaced righteousness. My parents flushed red from drinking swayed slightly as they entered, and my younger brother Evan trailed behind them with a stiff expression. My mother clutched her purse with trembling fingers, and my father clung to a folder thick with papers. He slammed it onto the marble island like it was a police file rather than a stack of documents he barely understood. "Sign these," he barked, his voice slurred but sharp enough to slice through the quiet room. His eyes were glassy, yet focused with a determination that only intoxicated anger can sharpen. My mother sniffled loudly, wiping her smudged mascara with the back of her hand. "For your brother," she said as if it explained everything. "He is getting married. He needs a proper home, not that small apartment." My stomach tightened. I had known about the engagement. I had not known they believed that my home, the one I had worked myself to exhaustion to buy, should become their solution. Evan did not look at me. He shifted awkwardly, pretending to admire the storm outside, though he could not hide the embarrassment flickering across his face. Still, he said nothing. My father opened the folder and shoved a page toward me, a transfer of property. The sprawled signature line waited like an open mouth. "You will sign," he said. "A daughter does not need a penthouse for herself. A daughter makes sacrifices for her family." My heart pounded hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I am 34 years old, financially independent, and living in a home I paid for with sleepless nights, overtime hours, and weekends spent on site inspections that left my feet aching. And yet, in front of them, I felt 16 again, small beneath the weight of their expectations. "I will not sign," I said quietly. The rain roared louder, as if reacting to the tension swelling inside the room. My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Do not be ungrateful, Emily. Think of your brother. Think of his future wife. They cannot have guests thinking our family lacks the means to support him." She twisted the truth effortlessly as she always had, turning selfishness into a moral obligation. Evan rubbed the back of his neck. "It would help," he muttered, still avoiding my eyes. That was all he contributed. Not a protest. Not a refusal to participate in this madness. Just a weak admission that he stood with them, not me. My father stepped closer, the scent of whiskey burning my nose. His voice rose. "We raised you. We put food on your table. We gave you a home. Now you repay us by acting like this is only yours." His finger jabbed toward the floor as if the very boards belonged to him. I kept my voice steady even as my pulse raced. "It is mine. I worked for it. I earned it. And I am not giving it away because you think I owe you something." My father's face twisted, reddening further. He grabbed a crystal glass from the counter and threw it aside. It shattered against the tile with a sound that pierced through me. My mother shrieked and burst into louder tears. "Look what you made him do!" she sobbed, blaming me for the chaos he caused. Evan finally stepped forward a little, but not close enough to intervene. "Dad, maybe we should talk calmly," he whispered, though he did not lift a hand to stop anything. My father ignored him. He lunged closer to me, planting his palm on the counter beside my arm, trapping me where I stood. "You will sign," he growled. "You will not embarrass this family." Something in me hardened. Maybe it was years of being dismissed. Maybe it was the exhaustion from carrying responsibilities no one helped me with. Maybe it was realizing that he saw me not as a daughter, but as a resource to be harvested. I straightened, met his eyes, and said in the clearest voice I had ever used with him, "This is my home. I am not signing." The silence that followed crackled with danger. His expression fractured and then twisted into something furious and unrecognizable. Before I could step back, he shoved me with the full weight of his body. The world spun as my back slammed into the edge of the kitchen counter. Pain exploded at the base of my skull, and a ringing filled my ears so violently it drowned out the storm and the sound of my own breath. My legs buckled. I crumpled to the cold floor, vision swimming in a haze of gray and white. Voices blurred. My mother screamed my name. My father's ragged breathing filled the air. Evan stammered something, footsteps shuffling as the three of them hovered in confusion, panic, or guilt, I could not tell which. I tried to lift my head, but the room tilted sharply, and a wave of darkness rolled in like a tide I could not resist. The last thing I saw was the underside of the pendant light above me, glowing soft and unfazed even as my world collapsed into silence. I lost consciousness in the home I built with my own hands, taken down not by an accident, not by fate, but by the man who was supposed to protect me above all others. I woke to the sharp scent of disinfectant and the cold touch of metal railing against my arm, the kind of sterile chill that only exists inside an emergency room. For a moment, I did not remember how I had gotten there. My mind floated in a strange blank space, as if my thoughts had been scattered and were now slowly drifting back into place. A soft beeping echoed nearby, steady and calm, completely at odds with the storm still raging behind my eyelids. I blinked until the overhead lights stopped blurring and the white ceiling of St. David's Medical Center finally came into focus. My head throbbed with a deep ache that pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and when I lifted a hand to touch the tender swelling near my temple, a sharp jolt of pain shot down my neck. I sucked in a breath. The movement made the room tilt, reminding me of the impact of the fall, the cold floor of my penthouse beneath me. Then it all returned in one crushing wave. My father shouting, my mother crying, Evan looking anywhere but at me. The shove, the counter slamming into the back of my head, the way the room had dimmed as though someone had turned a dial. I closed my eyes again, not because I wanted to remember, but because I needed a moment to accept that it had actually happened. A familiar voice cut through the cotton in my ears. "Miss Warren, can you hear me?" The doctor, a calm woman with warm brown eyes, leaned over me. "You were brought in last night by emergency responders. Your neighbor on the 22nd floor called after hearing a loud impact and shouting." She paused, studying my face. "Do you remember falling?" I hesitated. The truth was complicated. Did I fall? Yes. Did I slip? No. Did I want to give them more fuel for whatever story my parents would spin? Absolutely not. I stared up at the fluorescent light rather than at her. "I am not sure," I whispered. The doctor exchanged a brief look with a nurse, then returned her attention to me. "You have a moderate concussion. The swelling on your temple is from hitting a solid surface. We need to observe you for a few more hours, but you will be all right." Her voice lowered. "If someone hurt you, you can tell us. We are here to help." My throat tightened. The answer sat inside me like a stone, heavy and immovable, but speaking it aloud felt like reopening a wound before I could even catch my breath. I forced a small nod that revealed nothing. She did not push further. Instead, she checked my vitals, made a few notes on her tablet, and told me someone would return shortly. After she left, the silence felt even louder. I turned my head slowly, careful of the pain, and noticed my phone on the rolling tray beside the bed. The screen was shattered in a spiderweb pattern. It must have been crushed under someone's shoe during the chaos. I picked it up with trembling fingers and pressed the side button. Remarkably, it still worked. Notifications lit up immediately. My stomach twisted as I read the first message. It was from my mother. "Do not tell anyone what happened. Your father did not mean it. Please do not make this worse." Worse for who, I wondered. Worse for the man who had shoved his daughter hard enough to knock her unconscious. Worse for the woman who had watched it happen and blamed the victim instead of the aggressor. The next message was from my father. "Handle it. Do not create problems." Not a single word asking if I was alive. Then a message from Evan. "Sorry, sis, but I really need the place. You know how important this is." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. The absurdity of it all washed over me like another wave of nausea. They were not worried, not shaken, not remorseful. They were only concerned with their plans and their pride. To them, what happened was not violence. It was inconvenience, a temporary disruption on the way to whatever they believed they deserved. My chest tightened with a mix of anger and heartbreak, an ache so sharp it almost matched the pain in my head. I placed the phone face down on the blanket, unable to look at it any longer. A nurse entered quietly, adjusting the monitor beside me. "You have visitors if you want to see them," she said. My pulse spiked. "My parents?" I asked. She shook her head. "No one checked in at the desk for you. These are officers wanting to confirm the report from last night." Of course. The neighbor, the shouting, the crash. Someone had heard it and called for help. I took a slow breath. I was not ready. Not to explain, not to lie, not to unravel everything that had been tightly wound around my life since childhood. "Can they come back later?" I asked. The nurse nodded kindly. "I will let them know." After she left, I realized the truth settling inside me like a chilling certainty. My family had abandoned me in a hospital bed hours after my father had thrown me hard enough to leave me unconscious. They had not followed the ambulance. They had not asked for updates. They had not even pretended to care. The physical pain hurt, but the emotional blow cut deeper. I signed the discharge papers late in the morning once the dizziness eased enough for me to sit up without gripping the rails. The doctor encouraged me to rest, avoid screens, and return if symptoms worsened. She asked again if someone at home would be helping me. I told her no. She gave me a sad look, the kind that suggested she understood more than I had said. By the time I stepped into the sunlight outside the emergency room entrance, the storm had passed, but the air still felt heavy. My head throbbed with each heartbeat, and the world seemed a little dimmer, a little farther away than before. I called for a rideshare since I could not trust myself to drive. As the car pulled away from the hospital, I stared out the window at the streets of Austin glistening with rain. A single thought repeated itself like a pulse. They did not care if I lived. They cared only if I signed. I wrapped my arms around myself as the city blurred past, bracing for the cold truth waiting inside my home. Growing up in our small, worn-down house on the east side of Austin, I learned early that some children are chosen without ever earning it, and some are overlooked no matter how hard they try. My family operated on an unspoken hierarchy where my younger brother Evan stood firmly at the top, shining beneath a spotlight that never seemed to dim while I lived in the shadows outside its glow. My father worked long shifts hauling materials for a construction supplier. His hands always cracked his clothes, always covered in dust, and somewhere along the way he convinced himself that raising a son meant crafting a legacy while raising a daughter meant preparing her to eventually disappear into someone else's life. My mother adopted that belief as naturally as breathing. She adored Evan from the moment he was born, doting on him, praising him for every small accomplishment, excusing even his worst behavior. When he threw a tantrum, she laughed and called him passionate. When I cried quietly in my room, she told me to stop being dramatic. When Evan got a B in math, she baked him brownies for trying. When I came home with straight A's, she said that was expected. By the time I entered middle school, the pattern was set. Evan got the larger bedroom with windows facing the yard. I shared a room with boxes of holiday decorations and a single lamp that flickered whenever someone turned on the microwave. Evan got new clothes at the start of every school year. I wore hand-me-downs or whatever my mother patched together with her sewing kit. Evan got rides to practice karate and weekend camps. I walked home alone and spent evenings helping my mother clean, while Evan sprawled on the couch playing games. The imbalance was not subtle. It was the air we breathed, the ground we walked on, the way our family functioned. Still, I kept trying. I brought home medals, certificates, invitations to academic programs, anything I hoped might make them look at me the way they looked at him. But every time the response was the same nod, the same distracted hum, the same reminder that I should not expect praise for doing what was expected. When I earned a partial scholarship to a state university, I handed the acceptance letter to my parents with trembling excitement. My mother barely glanced at it. "So, you will cover the rest, right?" she asked. "And you will find somewhere cheap to live." As if she had been waiting for me to leave, grateful that someone else would now take over the burden of housing me. She told Evan not to worry about college expenses when his time came because they would take care of him. It was the first time I understood fully that fairness was a language they never intended to speak with me. My father had always come home with a thermos full of coffee and a cooler half full of beer. He started drinking earlier each evening as I grew older, and his temper grew with it. He never hit me when I was young, but he never protected me either, and his voice could cut deeper than any slap. When he wanted quiet, he yelled. When he wanted space, he shoved. When he was angry, he broke things. And whenever he frightened me, my mother scolded me for provoking him, as if it was natural to tiptoe through your own home, as if his rage was something we owed patience and respect. I learned to keep my head down, my voice soft, my emotions buried. My mother often reminded me that Evan needed support because he would carry the family name. She encouraged him to dream big, to follow his passions, to believe the world would bend for him. She told me to be practical, studious, and patient, not because she valued those traits, but because she thought that was the only role available to me. When I turned 17, I took a part-time job at a construction site, cleaning debris and organizing materials. The foreman noticed I understood blueprints faster than most new helpers, and he let me shadow the project manager on weekends. For the first time, someone saw value in me that had nothing to do with what I could give to others. I saved every paycheck. While my friends bought clothes or gadgets, I put money into a jar hidden behind a loose board in my closet. My father mocked me for working. My mother praised Evan for focusing on his grades, even though mine were better. But something inside me grew stronger each time they doubted me. A quiet rebellion, a promise to myself. A belief that the life I wanted would never be handed to me, so I would build it brick by brick, hour by exhausting hour. By the time I graduated, I earned a full scholarship through a program supporting women in engineering fields. My parents barely reacted. They told Evan again that he would never have to worry about tuition. I moved into a cramped dorm with peeling paint and flickering lights, and I felt freer than I ever had at home. During college, I worked night shifts at a diner, weekend shifts at a supply store, and summer internships with construction firms. I studied building codes, project logistics, and contract writing. I learned how to talk to electricians, architects, and inspectors. I kept saving. Every dollar had a purpose. Every sacrifice had meaning. When I finally accepted a full-time position as a project coordinator, I cried in my tiny studio apartment, not because of the job, but because I had proven to myself that my future did not belong to the family that ignored me. Years of hard work and careful saving eventually became a down payment. The day I signed the mortgage for my penthouse, the agent congratulated me with genuine excitement. My parents did not come. My mother sent a short message that said simply nice. My father did not say anything at all. They did not ask to see the place. They did not celebrate my achievement. They barely acknowledged it. But I had done it. I had built a life on my own terms without their approval, without their support, without their belief. And maybe that was the thread of resentment that snapped the night they stormed into my home, demanding I surrender it. Maybe they could not stand the fact that I had stepped out of the shadows they once confined me to and created a world that did not include their control. The idea that my brother needed a grand home to start his married life did not appear out of thin air. It grew slowly fed by pride, fear, and the quiet desperation that had been tightening around my parents for years. Evan had been dating Melissa for almost 3 years, a bright and ambitious woman from a well-established family in West Lake Hills. Her parents owned a chain of dental clinics, her brothers were already successful in their fields, and she carried herself with the easy confidence of someone who had never needed to question her worth. When Evan proposed, I was genuinely happy for him. I attended the engagement dinner, brought a thoughtful gift, and hugged him tightly. But even that night, I noticed the tension in my parents' eyes as they glanced around the upscale restaurant and whispered about the cost of the champagne or the shine of the silverware. It was envy disguised as discomfort, and it seeped into every conversation afterward. Melissa's family lived in a large stone house with sprawling windows and a manicured yard. At gatherings, her relatives spoke about vacations in Europe, high-end renovations, private school alumni events, all with the casual tone of people discussing their grocery lists. My parents tried to keep up, smiling, nodding, pretending they were not counting every dollar in their heads. Pride is a powerful motivator, especially for people who feel they have fallen behind. It was only a matter of time before they latched onto the idea that Evan deserved to stand shoulder to shoulder with Melissa's family, and that the responsibility to elevate him fell not on his own shoulders, but on mine. They began dropping hints months before the incident. My mother commented on the size of my penthouse during Thanksgiving, lingering on the phrase, "more rooms than one person needs." My father grumbled about how unfair it was that a young woman like me had a property he called too good for someone without a family. Evan remained silent, but his silence was never neutral. It was an endorsement, a quiet acceptance of the notion that my success existed for his convenience. I might have brushed it all aside if the truth about my parents' finances had not been hiding beneath the surface. The signs appeared long before I recognized them. My father's truck spent more time in the repair shop than on the road, and every time he cursed about the cost, he followed it with complaints about work hours being cut or contracts being slow. My mother took out a new store card every holiday season, claiming she needed it for discounts, but the bills piled up on the kitchen counter, envelopes stacked higher each month. Sometimes I would visit and notice scratch-off lottery tickets stuffed into drawers or crumpled receipts from the local bar on their coffee table. They insisted everything was fine, but their eyes gave them away. Anxiety lived in every glance they exchanged. One night, Melissa's parents invited my family to a dinner meant to discuss wedding plans. It was held at a sleek modern restaurant with tall glass walls and soft lighting, the kind of place where you could smell the expense in the air. My parents dressed in their best outfits, but I saw the discomfort etched into their posture the moment they walked through the doors. During dinner, Melissa's mother casually joked that she hoped Evan would not bring his bride home to a place with creaking floors or dusty windows. It was meant as light humor, but my parents' faces stiffened. My mother's forced smile tightened. My father's jaw flexed. Pride is fragile, and theirs cracked a little that evening. Afterward, while waiting for the valet to bring their car, my parents pulled me aside. "Your brother needs stability," my mother whispered. "A real home. Not that cramped apartment he is in now." I nodded, expecting her to suggest helping him find a better rental. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes. "You have a penthouse, plenty of space. You should let him and Melissa start their life there." My breath caught. I thought she was joking. She was not. My father added, "A family should support each other. You do not need something that big. It is too much for one person." Their words were not requests. They were obligations dressed as moral lessons. I refused, gently explaining that my home was not something I could simply hand over and that Evan and Melissa were adults capable of building their own path. My parents exchanged a disappointed look and changed the subject, but that moment planted a seed in their minds. From there, desperation did the rest. A few weeks before the night, everything fell apart. Evan called me unexpectedly. His voice held a tight edge. He confessed that Melissa's parents had hinted they were concerned about his lack of financial stability and his living situation. They believed a married couple deserved a suitable home, something impressive enough to reflect well on their family. Evan said he wanted to make them proud. He said he needed help. I told him I could not give him the penthouse, but I was willing to help him budget, look for better rentals, or assist with a down payment if he showed responsibility. He fell silent and ended the call quickly. I did not know until later that my parents were already drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out, a small loan overdue, repairs on my father's truck unpaid, bills hidden in drawers. They believed that if Evan moved into my penthouse, they could parade the address as proof of family success, easing the pressure from Melissa's parents and covering their own shortcomings. They saw my home not as the result of my sacrifices, but as a resource waiting to be claimed. And because they had spent my whole life treating me as the backup plan, they believed I would eventually cave. They believed their pride was reason enough. They believed blood meant ownership. They were wrong. The fallout began quietly, almost gently, the way a storm sometimes starts with a single drop of rain before the entire sky breaks open. At first, it was just a strange silence from my parents, a gap in communication that felt intentional rather than accidental. I assumed they were still angry about my refusal, but I underestimated just how far they were willing to go to punish me for protecting what was mine. The real damage began the morning after I returned from the hospital, when I opened my phone to find a flood of notifications from cousins, aunts, and distant relatives I had not spoken to in months. Some messages were sharp and accusatory, others passive-aggressive, but all carried the same unmistakable tone of judgment. My mother had begun making calls the moment she got home. She had always been skilled at shaping a narrative-bending truth until it suited her purpose, and this time, her purpose was simple. She needed to ensure that the shame her pride felt did not settle on her. Instead, she shifted it onto me. According to the version of events she recited to the family, I had disrespected them, screamed at my father without reason, and refused a simple request that any loving daughter would have agreed to. She claimed I had kicked them out, slammed the door in their faces, and sent my father into a spiral of distress that left him shattered. She also made sure to emphasize that my penthouse was a symbol of selfishness, something I used to elevate myself above the family that had raised me. Not once did she mention the shove that sent me to the emergency room. Not once did she say that my father had crossed a line no parent should ever cross. Instead, she twisted reality until I became a villain in a story where she and my father were the victims. The family believed her because they always believed the loudest voice. Relatives who had barely noticed my achievements now found endless time to write lengthy Facebook posts about how children these days lacked respect and how some daughters forgot the sacrifices their parents made. One aunt shared a picture of Evan and Melissa smiling at a barbecue and wrote that some people were trying to ruin joyful milestones for others. Another cousin commented that I had always been too proud for my own good. A distant uncle declared that God punishes ungrateful children. None of them asked for my side of the story. None of them wondered why my mother had made so many phone calls in one night. None of them questioned why I had not responded. Their certainty in my guilt was easier than acknowledging the possibility of abuse within their own bloodline. Evan added fuel in his own careless way. He posted a vague message on social media about loyalty and betrayal, insisting he never expected his own sister to stand in the way of his future. He did not name me, but he did not need to. Anyone connected to our family knew who he meant. Messages poured in beneath his post, calling him strong, calling him patient, calling him understanding for putting up with such drama. Melissa liked every comment but did not say a word. Her silence was a statement in itself. In the following days, I received messages from two cousins telling me that my mother had cried for hours and that my father was devastated. They said the least I could do was apologize. Apologize for what I wondered, for being pushed so hard that I lost consciousness, for surviving, for refusing to surrender the home I earned through years of sacrifice. The manipulation worked on those who wanted to believe it. My mother played her part carefully, alternating between crying on the phone and giving short, resigned statements about how she did not want to lose her daughter, but did not know what else to do. She presented herself as hurt and helpless, the image of a mother abandoned by a daughter who could not be bothered to support her family. My father, in contrast, stayed silent. His silence became ammunition for others to project whatever narrative suited them. They imagined him heartbroken. They imagined him fragile. They imagined him too proud to admit how much I had wounded him. Not one person imagined him standing in my kitchen, whiskey burning on his breath, shoving me with enough force to send my skull crashing into solid stone. That truth was too inconvenient for the story they wanted. The emotional weight pressed down harder each day. I found myself spiraling between anger and disbelief, between sorrow and numbness. I scrolled through the messages again and again, wondering how people could be so quick to judge how they could choose a comfortable lie over a painful truth. I considered responding, defending myself, telling the world exactly what happened, but I knew it would not matter. People do not abandon a comfortable story for an uncomfortable truth. They cling to the version that requires the least self-reflection. My parents had drawn the first line in the battlefield of public opinion. They made sure the family saw me not as a daughter who had been hurt, but as an obstacle standing in the way of Evan's happiness and their pride. The loneliness that followed was unlike anything I had felt before. I had long known I was not the chosen child, but now I felt like I had been erased. My parents had rewritten me into a stranger, a threat, a disappointment, someone to be punished, shamed, isolated. And somehow in their distorted view, they believed this punishment would force me to surrender. They believed guilt would bend me. They believed the weight of the family's judgment would bring me to my knees. But as I sat alone in my living room, the lights dimmed and the bruise on my temple throbbing in rhythm with my heartbeat, a different emotion began to rise slowly through the pain. Not fear, not guilt. Clarity. They had miscalculated. They thought they could break me with lies. They did not yet understand that truth was the one weapon they could never take from me. The first legal threat arrived 3 days after the hospital visit, tucked inside a crisp envelope that looked far too formal for the chaos my family had created. It was waiting on my doormat when I opened the door to grab a delivery, its heavy paper and embossed return address standing out like a warning flare. For a moment, I simply stared at it, feeling the same cold, sinking sensation I had felt when I saw my mother's flood of lies on social media. My family had abandoned me in a hospital bed without remorse, but apparently that had only been their opening move. I picked up the envelope with trembling fingers and carried it to the kitchen, placing it on the island where my father had slammed his folder the night he shoved me to the floor. The bruise on my temple ached, as if the memory itself had weight. I opened the envelope slowly, expecting drama, but not prepared for the stupidity it contained. Inside was a letter from a law office on the outskirts of town, a place that mostly handled traffic violations and small claims disputes. The letter claimed that my parents and I had entered into something they called a family agreement. According to the letter, there had been a verbal understanding that when Evan married, the penthouse would automatically become his marital home. The attorney wrote that it had been the shared intention of the family that the property was to be used for Evan's future, and that I was now refusing to honor the trust placed in me. The audacity of it stunned me into silence. A verbal agreement, one that apparently gave away real estate worth more than everything my parents owned, combined, a verbal agreement that no one had ever spoken out loud, including the imaginary version of me who would supposedly have agreed to it. The letter continued with a tone so patronizing it made my stomach twist. It claimed my refusal had caused emotional distress and financial hardship to my parents and brother. It insisted that the honorable and ethical path was to sign over the property voluntarily before legal action became necessary. My hands shook with a mixture of disbelief and anger. They had gone from manipulating relatives to fabricating a legal narrative in less than a week. I read the lines again slower this time, picking apart their flimsy construction. The law office had no real evidence. They claimed a verbal promise but offered no witnesses, no dates, no context. They tried to frame my success as something gifted by the family rather than earned through years of backbreaking work. They demanded compliance out of loyalty, then threatened consequences if I dared to protect myself. It was absurd, it was pathetic, and it was dangerous. In the wrong hands, even a flimsy accusation could become a weapon, especially in court, especially against a woman like me who had no partner or children to stand beside her. My breathing grew shallow as the weight of it pressed against me. It was not just a letter. It was a declaration of war disguised as family concern. I took a deep breath and read the closing paragraph. It stated that if I did not respond within 10 days, they would consider my silence an admission of guilt and pursue further action. The threat was ridiculous from a legal standpoint, but intimidation relies on fear, not facts. Clearly, they assumed fear would be enough to make me fold. They did not know me at all. Still, as I placed the letter on the counter, a wave of sadness washed over me. Not because I believed the claim, not because I feared the outcome, but because my family had chosen a path that treated me not as a daughter, not as a human being, but as a stumbling block standing in the way of their pride. I walked to the living room and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the city lights flickering beyond the glass. Cars moved below like streaks of silver people living their lives unaware that in a home high above the streets, a family was tearing itself apart over entitlement and desperation. The next morning, the situation escalated. I woke to another message from a cousin I barely spoke to, telling me I should be ashamed for trying to steal from my own family and that everyone knew about the agreement. Agreement. The word made my jaw clench. My mother had wasted no time broadcasting the lie, telling everyone who would listen that the penthouse had always been intended for Evan and that I was breaking a promise. By midday, 3 more relatives had commented on Evan's vague loyalty post, encouraging him to take legal action if necessary. One even said he should fight for what was rightfully his. I wanted to scream, rightfully his. The entitlement radiating through those words threatened to crush what little patience I had left. By evening, I received a second letter. This one was shorter, more aggressive, and framed as a formal notice of potential legal dispute. They had doubled down. They wanted me scared. They wanted me cornered. They wanted me compliant. But all they succeeded in doing was waking a part of me I had kept buried for years. The part that had survived long nights working overtime, that had pushed through exhaustion and fear, that had built a life from nothing while my family expected me to shrink. I stood at the kitchen counter, letter in hand, and finally understood. They were not going to stop. They were not going to apologize. They were not going to face what really happened. They would lie. They would manipulate. They would threaten, and they would do all of it while pretending they were the victims. They believed I was still the quiet girl who swallowed her pain and accepted her place in the shadows. They were wrong. I placed both letters into a folder, the same place I kept every mortgage statement, contractor invoice, and maintenance receipt from the past 3 years. The binder that represented my independence, my proof, my truth. This was no longer just a family argument. It was a legal battle waiting to ignite. And for the first time, as fear and sadness settled into determination, I knew I would not face it alone. I would find someone who saw through their lies, someone who could fight back, someone who could help me reclaim control over the narrative my family was trying to steal. They wanted a war. They were about to get one. The binder sat on the top shelf of my home office, tucked between old project manuals and a stack of industry guides I had not opened in years. It looked unremarkable, a simple gray case with a metal clip and faint scratches along the edge. But as I pulled it down, feeling the weight of it settle into my hands, I realized it held something more valuable than any sentimental keepsake my family had ever given me. It held the proof of my life documented piece by piece, year after year, in a way that made their lies crumble before they even fully formed. I placed the binder on the desk and opened it slowly, the plastic sleeves whispering as they slid apart. The first page was the purchase agreement for the Penthouse, the document I had signed with trembling hands the day I closed on the property. My name appeared boldly on the buyer line, printed in clean black ink, and beneath it the mortgage information, the loan terms, and the exact amount of my down payment. There were no co-signers listed, no shared contributions, no family members waiting in the wings. Just me. The memory of that day resurfaced clearly. I remembered standing with the agent in the lobby of the building holding the keys and trying not to cry. I had worked 70-hour weeks for almost 5 years to make that moment possible. I had lived in cramped apartments, eaten cheap meals, and skipped vacations while my peers posted photos from beaches and mountain trails. I had turned every spare dollar into savings, every setback into motivation. And not once had my parents offered support. Not emotional, not financial, not even a congratulatory phone call. I flipped to the next page. The wire transfer receipt. The numbers stared back at me, a reminder of the sacrifices I had made. That was my money, my savings, the direct result of years of overtime shifts and weekend contracts. There was no handwritten note saying contributed by family, because they had contributed nothing. The next pages were my mortgage statements, 36 of them each with the same account number, each with clear payment confirmations drawn solely from my checking account. I traced my finger down the columns of principal and interest, thinking of the nights I had come home exhausted, the days I had skipped meals to save time, the moments I questioned whether owning a home at my age was even realistic. But I had done it. I had paid every cent, alone. Page after page, the binder dismantled every lie my parents and Evan tried to build. If there had been some imaginary agreement, some supposed family plan, it would have shown up somewhere in these documents. A co-signer, a shared bank draft, a witness statement, something. But there was nothing, not even the faintest trace of involvement from them. Still, the physical evidence was only half the story. As I turned another page, I reached the home inspection report dated 6 months after my purchase. It listed the repairs I paid for myself: roof maintenance, electrical upgrades, replacing old fixtures. These were not the responsibilities of someone babysitting a property for her brother. These were the choices of a homeowner investing in her future. I flipped again and found photos of the renovation work I coordinated. New countertops, updated lighting, the custom shelving I designed and installed with the help of a subcontractor from one of my job sites. Each improvement had been paid for with my earnings and my labor. Again, no family involvement, not even a suggestion. As I scanned the binder, something inside me shifted. For days I had been drowning in their lies, overwhelmed by the weight of their manipulation. But here in the pages of this binder, reality stood unshaken. My family could rewrite stories, twist conversations, and hide behind false narratives, but they could not rewrite numbers. They could not erase signatures. They could not undo timestamps. Facts were facts, and I had them all. I turned to the last section, the financial assessments and appraisal reports. One document in particular caught my eye, a market valuation completed the previous year when I considered refinancing. It listed the estimated equity I had built, a significant amount, far more than I had realized at the time. My breath caught. I finally understood why Evan and my parents were so desperate. This was not just about pride or gifts or tradition. This was about money. A lot of money. Enough to clear debts. Enough to save reputations. Enough to rescue Evan from the embarrassment of appearing less successful than Melissa's family. I closed the binder and pressed my hands flat on the cover, grounding myself. This was what they did not expect. They had assumed I lived blindly, carelessly, without organizing my life or protecting my work. They thought I would crumble under emotional pressure, that guilt and isolation would break me before logic had a chance to settle. They believed I was still the obedient daughter they had trained to stay quiet. They were wrong. The binder was not just documentation. It was protection. It was strategy. It was a reminder that I had built something powerful and real, something no amount of manipulation could erase. And now it was ammunition. As I stood in my office, listening to the distant hum of the city outside the windows, a calm certainty replaced the anxiety that had plagued me for days. I was not helpless. I was not alone, and I was not the one who should be afraid. I placed the binder gently into my bag. They wanted to turn this into a legal war. Fine. I was ready to fight. Because once the truth was laid out in front of them with the clarity and precision of documented evidence, they would finally realize something they had spent my entire life refusing to see. They underestimated the wrong daughter. The truth about my brother did not arrive in one dramatic revelation. It surfaced slowly, piece by piece, like debris rising in muddy water after a storm. At first, I still held on to the belief that Evan was simply misguided, pushed into desperation by our parents' expectations and the overwhelming pressure of trying to impress Melissa's wealthy family. I wanted to believe he was caught in the middle, unsure how to stand up for himself, unable to confront our parents' manipulation. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized that Evan was not a passive participant. He was an architect in the very foundation of the scheme they were building around me. The first hint appeared when I reviewed my messages and saw how quickly he had shifted into entitlement. He did not ask if I was all right after the hospital incident. He did not check whether I needed help or even acknowledge that our father had crossed a line. Instead, his only concern was the penthouse. His short, careless message echoed in my mind. "Sorry, sis, but I really need the place." As if my home were a tool, as if my injury were an inconvenience, as if everything I had worked for was merely an obstacle standing in the way of his future. I brushed it off at first, thinking he was overwhelmed by wedding plans and family pressure, but the truth revealed itself in a more concrete form when I received a call from a mutual acquaintance named Jordan, someone who had worked with Evan briefly at a small tech support company. Jordan hesitated before speaking, almost apologetic, but finally admitted that Evan had not been employed there for nearly a year. He had been fired for chronic lateness and dishonesty involving submitted reports. According to Jordan, Evan had borrowed money from several coworkers, each time promising to pay it back as soon as he received a project bonus that never existed. The debts piled up until management stepped in. He had quietly disappeared after that, leaving behind unpaid obligations and angry co-workers who no longer believed a single word he said. I ended the call and sat in stunned silence. My parents had proudly told everyone Evan was working at a promising company and climbing the ladder fast. They said he was responsible and hardworking and would soon be promoted. In truth, he had been unemployed for months. He had been living off credit cards, favors, and whatever money my parents managed to scrape together. The deeper I dug, the uglier the story became. I reviewed public court records and discovered Evan had been sued twice in the past 2 years for unpaid personal loans. Nothing severe enough to make headlines, but damaging enough to show a pattern. A pattern my parents had been hiding. A pattern Evan had pretended did not exist. The worst discovery came when I finally confronted Melissa's cousin, someone I barely knew, but who had always been friendlier than the rest of her family. He reluctantly admitted that Melissa had threatened to call off the engagement unless Evan provided proof of financial stability. Her family believed marriage should be a partnership between equals, and they had grown concerned that Evan was hiding things. He told them he had savings and investments and would soon move into a beautiful space. He showed them pictures of my penthouse as if it were already his. My breath caught when I heard that. He had walked through my home, taken photos of my living room, my kitchen, my balcony view, and presented them as his own to impress people he barely knew. My home had become a prop in his lie. The cousin hesitated before revealing the final detail. Evan claimed he had already spoken to me about transferring the property and that I had agreed. That was when everything inside me hardened. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was deliberate. My brother, the same boy I once helped with homework, the same young man I defended in childhood arguments, the same person I assumed would protect me if our parents ever went too far, had turned my achievements into a shield for his failures. He had used my success to construct a fantasy of competence that fooled Melissa's family long enough to secure their approval. And when that fantasy began to crack, he expected me to fix it. He expected me to sacrifice everything to keep his life from collapsing. It explained so much. The urgency in his voice whenever he hinted about moving into my home. The nervousness at family dinners. The way he avoided eye contact whenever the topic of finances came up. He had been cornered by his own lies, and instead of taking responsibility, he had decided the solution was to step into a life I had built through years of exhausting effort and pretend it belonged to him. The more details I uncovered, the clearer his motivations became. He did not want the penthouse because he admired me. He wanted it because he believed he deserved it, because he believed I had only achieved success because our parents had supported me a lie. He repeated so often he likely believed it himself. Because he believed daughters were temporary, but sons carried legacies. Because he believed he was entitled to the fruits of my labor simply by virtue of being born male and favored, and because he believed I would not fight back. He believed I would fold from guilt. He believed I would crumble under family pressure. He believed I would stay quiet as he stepped into my life and claimed my work as his own. But he never expected the binder. He never expected the truth. And he certainly never expected the version of me who had grown tired of being invisible. I realized something profound that day. Evan was not a victim of our parents. He was their reflection, the entitlement, the manipulation, the belief that my achievements existed for his benefit. He had inherited all of it, and now he was weaponizing it. For years I had seen him as a brother who needed guidance. Now I saw him clearly for the first time. He was not the unchosen sibling. He was the chosen one who believed it gave him ownership over everyone else, especially me. The truth about my parents did not come to me all at once. It unfolded slowly, spreading through my mind like a stain I could no longer scrub away. For most of my life, I believed their favoritism toward Evan came from cultural habit or personal bias, something rooted in old values and traditional thinking. I thought their dismissiveness toward me was just insensitivity, not malice. But the more I examined their actions through the lens of recent events, the clearer their motivations became. They did not just favor Evan. They depended on him emotionally while depending on me financially. They built their lives on a delicate illusion where Evan was the golden son destined to bring pride to the family, while I was the silent worker who filled in the gaps they pretended not to see. And now that illusion was collapsing. The first crack in their facade appeared when I discovered the second mortgage on their home. I had not known about it until I checked property records for something completely unrelated. The record showed they had refinanced just 11 months earlier, taking out a large sum that nearly matched the amount of debt Evan owed. My hands grew cold as I scrolled through the documents. The dates lined up perfectly with the period when Evan lost his job and started spiraling. My parents had been drowning financially for months. They had not asked me for help because asking would mean admitting failure. Instead, they gambled on the illusion that everything would magically resolve itself once Evan married into a wealthier family. They used their home as collateral to buy him time. And when that time ran out, they looked to me. Not for emotional support, not for guidance, not for empathy, but for rescue. When I connected the dots, I felt something inside me fracture. They had been sinking while pretending to float, all the while throwing their weight on me to keep themselves above water. They positioned Evan as the center of their world because he represented potential. They positioned me on the outer ring because I represented utility. The day it all clicked, I sat at my kitchen table staring at bank statements, tax documents, and the binder that had become my shield. I remembered my childhood suddenly through a different lens. The reason my mother gave Evan new clothes while patching mine was not simply favoritism, it was investment. She saw him as the family's future, the one worth dressing up, the one worth supporting publicly. I was the background labor, the one expected to sacrifice quietly, the one whose success they took credit for while refusing to acknowledge the work behind it. The reason my father snarled at me whenever I questioned something was not frustration but insecurity. He depended on the illusion that he remained the authority in the household, even when I surpassed him in stability, income, and independence. His identity relied on believing he was still the pillar, even though his foundation had cracked years earlier under the weight of financial mistakes he never admitted. I remembered moments that felt small at the time, but now loomed large. My mother asking me to cover a bill because Evan was stressed. My father shrugging when I asked why Evan was never asked to help. Their insistence that everything I earned was a blessing to the family, not to me. Their constant reminders that daughters should be grateful. Their resentment whenever I took pride in my accomplishments. I realized they saw my successes as a family resource, not a personal achievement. They praised Evan for existing. They expected me to compensate for his failures. And now their financial desperation had reached a breaking point. My father's drinking had worsened in the past year. He tried to hide it, but the signs were obvious. Empty bottles in the recycling bin. Unexplained charges on their bank statements. Nights when he slurred his speech on the phone. Afternoons when he snapped over the slightest inconvenience. I once thought he drank because he was stressed from work. Now I saw he drank because reality was slipping away and alcohol made it easier to avoid the truth. My mother was no better. Her emotional manipulation had sharpened over the years into something almost practiced, as though she had trained herself to weaponize guilt with precision. She had mastered crying on cue, sighing at the perfect moment, whispering just enough vulnerability to pull sympathy from anyone who listened. She used her fragility as a mask to hide the entitlement beneath. When the social media attacks began, they were not misguided reactions. They were calculated moves meant to isolate me emotionally before the legal lies arrived. They had been preparing the battlefield long before I realized a war had begun. And the worst part was that they believed wholeheartedly in their own righteousness. They believed Evan deserved my home because he was their son. They believed I owed them because they raised me. They believed I was selfish for protecting what was mine. They believed their financial collapse was something I was obligated to fix. Their sense of entitlement was not a flaw. It was a worldview, a belief system built on years of unequal treatment. A system where Evan's comfort mattered more than my safety. A system where my worth was measured by how much I could sacrifice. I remembered the look in my father's eyes the night he shoved me. It was not surprise. It was not regret. It was fury. Fury that I had dared to say no. Fury that I had broken the unwritten rules. Fury that I had refused to surrender myself for the sake of their pride. And now, as I connected the financial lies with the emotional ones, I understood something painful but necessary. My parents loved the version of me who stayed silent. They never loved the version who stood up. I leaned back in my chair and felt a strange calm settle in my chest. Their desperation explained their actions, but it did not excuse them. Their struggles were real, but their cruelty was intentional. Their pride was fragile, but their choices were deliberate. And for the first time in my life, I saw them not as parents who occasionally hurt me, but as people who believed they had the right to use me. They were not misguided. They were entitled. They were not unaware. They were willing. And now I knew the truth. They were not trying to save Evan's future. They were trying to save themselves. By the time I finished sorting through the binder and connecting the final threads of truth about my family, I realized something important. I could not win this alone. Not because I was weak, not because I could not fight, but because the battle was no longer emotional. It had crossed into legal territory, a place where precision mattered, where facts needed to be weaponized with expertise, where every misstep could cost me the home I had built from the ground up. My family was reckless, but recklessness paired with desperation could still land blows if I did not defend myself with strategy rather than fear. So I did something my parents never expected. I reached for professional help. I spent 2 days researching attorneys who specialized in real estate litigation, combing through reviews, case histories, and testimonials. I wanted someone who did not flinch in the face of lies, someone who had seen worse than family manipulation and knew exactly how to dismantle it. That was when I found the name Sandra Kim, former prosecutor, 15 years of experience, a reputation so sharp it almost cut through the screen. Clients described her as relentless in the courtroom, precise in communication, and immune to intimidation. One reviewer wrote that hiring her felt like bringing a tank to a fistfight. I booked a consultation for the next morning. The moment I stepped into her office, I felt the atmosphere shift. The space was clean, but not minimal, decorated with framed case victories and diplomas from top universities. There was no softness meant to soothe. It was a place where problems came to die. Sandra rose from her desk to greet me, her dark hair pulled into a low ponytail, her eyes observant and sharp behind thin-rimmed glasses. She was calm, collected, and radiated the kind of confidence people cannot fake. "Tell me everything," she said as we sat across from each other. And I did. I recounted the shove, the hospital visit, the social attacks, the fabricated family agreement, the legal letters, the financial manipulation, the pressure surrounding Evan's wedding, and the complete disregard for my safety. I showed her the binder piece by piece, sliding each document across the table like ammunition. With every page she read, her expression grew more focused. There was no pity in her eyes, only calculation. When I finished, she leaned back slightly, tapping her pen on the desk in a slow, rhythmic pattern. "They do not have a case," she said plainly. "Not a trace of legitimacy. There is no evidence of a verbal agreement, no mutual understanding, no documentation, no contribution from them. Everything about this is built on intimidation rather than law." Hearing someone say it so clearly made something inside me loosen. For the first time in weeks, I felt my lungs expand fully. But she continued before I could even breathe out. "However," she said, "the danger is in their willingness to escalate. People who believe they are entitled will push boundaries until someone forces them to stop. And that someone is going to be me." Her certainty was startling and comforting. She leaned forward and outlined a plan with the precision of a surgeon. Step 1 was filing for a declaratory judgment. A judge would review the documentation and issue a formal statement declaring me the sole owner of the property. This would preempt their false claims and make it harder for them to pursue legal action. Step 2 was drafting a cease and desist letter addressed to my parents and Evan, warning them to stop making false statements, stop contacting me with demands, and stop spreading misinformation. Step 3 was the part that made my pulse quicken. If they continued, she said, we counter. For abuse of process, for intentional infliction of emotional distress, for attempting to commit fraud by fabricating a family agreement that never existed. Her voice did not waver. "This is not a negotiation. It is a boundary, and boundaries are only effective when enforced." I felt warmth spreading through my chest, the warmth of validation, of finally being seen, of finally being supported. For so long, I had been fighting alone, navigating emotional landmines without allies. Now, someone stood on my side who did not tremble around conflict, who did not excuse my family's behavior as unfortunate misunderstanding. Sandra saw the situation clearly, and she believed me. She asked a few more questions clarifying exact dates and details. Her tone remained steady, never sensationalizing, never dramatizing, simply organizing facts with scientific clarity. When she finally put her pen down, she looked directly at me. "You did nothing wrong," she said. "Do you understand that this is not your burden? This is their dishonesty colliding with your boundaries." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. I had spent years internalizing blame for everything my family twisted. Hearing someone dismantle that narrative felt like stepping into sunlight after living underground. Sandra printed the retainer agreement and slid it across the table. I did not hesitate. I signed. My hand did not shake. She immediately began drafting the documents. The click of her keyboard echoed like the sound of armor being forged. She printed the first draft of the cease and desist letter and handed it to me. The tone was crisp, authoritative, and carried the weight of someone who knew the law well enough to tear down anyone who tried to misuse it. Reading it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. When we finished, she asked if I felt safe returning home. I hesitated but nodded. She gave me her direct number and instructions for what to do if my family attempted to contact me in person. As I left her office, something inside me shifted profoundly. I was no longer bracing for the next blow. I was standing tall. When the elevator doors closed around me, I realized I was no longer afraid. My family had underestimated me. They had underestimated the law. And most of all, they had underestimated the power of a woman who finally stopped apologizing for choosing herself. The turning point did not arrive with an explosion. It arrived with a quiet certainty, the kind that settles into your bones and tells you there is no going back. 2 days after meeting with Sandra, she finalized the filings for the declaratory judgment and stamped the cease and desist letters with the authority of someone who had fought 1,000 battles just like mine. When she handed me the copies, each page crisp and official, I felt something inside me shift from fear into resolve. The legal process had officially begun, and for the first time since the night of the shove, I was no longer reacting. I was acting. The morning we submitted the documents to the courthouse, the air outside felt cool and sharp, as if the city itself understood the gravity of what we were doing. I followed Sandra through the courthouse doors, watching her heels click against the polished floor with unwavering confidence. The clerk accepted our filings, stamped them, and returned the copies. That sound of the stamp hitting the paper echoed in my ears long after we left the building. It was the sound of boundaries becoming law. As we walked back to her office to prepare the next steps, Sandra reviewed the expected timeline. The judge would receive our petition within days. My parents and Evan would receive their cease and desist notices by certified mail. If they chose to respond, it would have to be through legal channels, not drunken visits or manipulative phone calls. For the first time, the playing field was leveled. When I returned home that afternoon, my heart pounded as I approached the elevator. Every time I stepped into my penthouse since the incident, I half expected my family to ambush me with more accusations or emotional attacks. But this time, my fear was met with silence, a peaceful silence, the calm before a different storm. That evening, the first reaction arrived. My phone buzzed with a call from my mother. I let it ring. She tried again. I let it ring again. Then the messages started. Long, frantic paragraphs accusing me of overreacting, of betraying the family, of humiliating them by involving the law. Her hysteria poured through every sentence, but beneath the emotional theatrics, I could hear something new. Fear. Real fear. A fear she had never shown before because she never believed I had the strength to fight her. An hour later, my father called. He did not leave a voicemail, perhaps realizing that anger does not translate well into recorded evidence. When I refused to respond, he sent a short message that read, "You are making a mistake." I stared at it, feeling nothing. Not guilt, not anger, just clarity. The next morning, Evan reached out. Unlike my parents, he started with a thin layer of charm, as if pretending to be reasonable would undo everything. "Sis, can we talk about this?" he wrote. "Come on, this is going too far." Then he added a sentence that revealed the truth beneath his performance. "The place would make everything easier for me. The entitlement radiated off the screen. I did not reply. Later that afternoon, Sandra called to say the certified mail receipts showed my parents and Evan had accepted the letters. She paused before continuing. "They contacted my office," she said. "They sounded panicked." A small part of me felt vindicated, not because I wanted them to experience fear, but because for once, they were facing consequences instead of hiding behind excuses. Sandra continued. Their attorney requested a discussion, but I informed him that all communication must remain formal until we see whether they intend to comply. They know you are represented now. That sentence warmed me more than it should have. For years, I had defended myself alone in arguments and tears and silence. Now I was not alone. That evening, I sat on my balcony watching the sun dip behind the skyline. The city glowed with soft gold light, and I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders as the breeze rustled the plants near my sliding door. The bruise on my temple had faded to a dull brown, but the memory still pulsed beneath my skin. I thought about how close they had come to taking everything, how easily they had turned violent, how confidently they had lied, how far they were willing to go to protect Evan's image and save themselves from financial ruin. And yet, for the first time, the memory did not suffocate me. It strengthened me. I was still here. The next morning delivered the first real shift. Sandra forwarded me an email from the attorney representing my parents and Evan. It was terse, formal, and clearly written under pressure. They requested a meeting to discuss possible resolution. Sandra responded with equal professionalism, reminding them that my safety and legal rights were the priority and that any discussion would require clear terms and controlled conditions. She then called me, her tone calm but purposeful. "They are crumbling," she said. "People who lie often collapse when confronted with documentation. It forces them to face the truth they have spent years avoiding." I exhaled slowly, feeling something unwind deep inside my chest. Their panic did not erase the pain, but it proved something vital. I had been right to fight. I had been right to protect myself. I had been right to stop being their silent support system. Over the next 2 days, the communication from my family slowed. The accusatory messages stopped. The dramatic calls faded. They were not apologizing, but they were retreating. And beneath that retreat was another truth. This was the moment the power shifted. The same people who had screamed at me, manipulated me, and shoved me into unconsciousness were now forced to face consequences they never imagined. When Sandra called to confirm the date for the settlement conference, I felt a sense of finality settle over me. This was no longer a conflict in the shadows. It was formal, documented, controlled, and most importantly, I was no longer fighting for their approval. I was fighting for my home, for my autonomy, for the version of myself I had spent years becoming. As I stood in the center of my penthouse that evening, the city lights reflecting across the room, I whispered to myself, "This is the turning point." Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I finally understood something powerful. I was no longer the daughter they could control. I was no longer the sister they could manipulate. I was a woman reclaiming her life through the truth. The settlement conference took place in a downtown office tower with glass walls that made the entire floor feel like a display case, a place where truth was forced into the open whether anyone liked it or not. I arrived with Sandra at my side, her expression calm and unreadable, as if she had already rehearsed every possible outcome and found none of them intimidating. The elevator ride felt endless. My palms were damp, my heart pounding against my ribs, but beneath the nerves there was something else too, a quiet strength that had grown inside me ever since the night I woke alone in the emergency room. When the doors opened, Sandra placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder and guided me toward the conference room. Through the glass, I could already see them. My mother sat stiffly in a pale sweater, twisting a tissue in her hands. My father leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the table as if he were preparing for a fight he still believed he could win. Evan sat between them, hunched slightly, his face pale, his fingers tapping anxiously against his knee. Their attorney, a middle-aged man with a shiny forehead and tired eyes, stood when he saw us enter. "Good morning," he said with a forced politeness. No one else spoke. Sandra greeted him with a quick nod, then pulled out a chair for me. As I sat, my father finally looked up. His eyes held the same resentment I had seen the night he shoved me, a resentment sharpened now by the fact that I was sitting across from him with a lawyer rather than kneeling before him in guilt. "So, this is what you want," he muttered. "Dragging us into court." Sandra responded before I could speak. "Your actions brought us here, not hers. Now let us proceed." The attorney cleared his throat and attempted to begin with a rehearsed speech about misunderstandings and family communication. Sandra cut him off with the subtle raise of a hand. "We are not here to debate emotions. We are here to address facts." She opened her binder, the same binder that had become my anchor through the chaos, and slid the first exhibit across the table. The purchase agreement. My father glanced at it briefly, then looked away as if the paper itself insulted him. Sandra spoke clearly. "This document shows that my client purchased her home independently. No co-signers, no shared contributions, no involvement from any other party." She slid the next exhibit forward. Mortgage statements, property tax receipts, renovation invoices, every payment from her account alone. My mother shifted uncomfortably, her tissues twisting tighter in her hands. The attorney picked up the papers and skimmed them, his mouth tightening as he read. Next, Sandra placed the appraisal report and equity analysis on the table. "This is the current value of the property. This is what your clients attempted to obtain through intimidation, fabricated claims, and harassment." My father slammed his fist against the table, causing the glasses of water to tremble. "That is our family's investment," he snapped. "She owes us." Sandra did not flinch. "Show me one document that supports that statement, one financial record, one written agreement, one contribution." Silence filled the room. My father's face reddened and he leaned back with a scowl. Sandra continued sliding forward the final set of papers. The fabricated family agreement, the cease and desist orders, the emergency room record showing I was injured the night they confronted me. Evan swallowed hard, avoiding my gaze. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Sandra's voice remained steady. "Your clients made false claims for financial gain. They attempted to coerce my client into surrendering her legally owned property and spread defamatory statements when she refused. If they continue, we will pursue counterclaims for abuse of process and intentional infliction of emotional distress." The attorney exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He turned toward my parents. "You did not tell me about the medical record." My mother's voice cracked. "It was an accident." She fell. Sandra responded before the attorney could. The emergency responders noted lack of forced entry signs of struggle and inconsistent statements from all three individuals present. The room went silent again. My father glared at me, his voice low and bitter. "You are tearing this family apart." That sentence struck something deep inside me, not because it was true, but because of how easily they used it as a weapon. For years they had repeated it whenever I refused to sacrifice for Evan. Now they wielded it again, hoping it would force me back into silence. I lifted my chin and finally spoke, my voice steadier than I expected. "I am not tearing the family apart. I am refusing to let you destroy my life." My mother shook her head, trembling. "We just wanted what was fair." "Fair," I repeated softly. "Fair would have been raising us equally. Fair would have been congratulating me when I succeeded. Fair would have been not shoving your daughter into a counter and leaving her unconscious on her own floor." The tissue dropped from her hands. My father stiffened. Evan looked like he might be sick. Sandra leaned forward slightly. "This meeting is your opportunity to end this before legal consequences escalate." Her words were controlled but carried the weight of finality. "Your clients can withdraw all claims, sign a recognition of sole ownership, and agree to cease all harassment." The attorney looked at my parents, his voice lowered. "You need to consider this seriously. If this goes to court, you will lose. The evidence is overwhelmingly in her favor." My father opened his mouth, but my mother placed a shaking hand on his arm, her voice breaking. "We cannot afford a lawsuit." For a moment, the illusion of their power cracked completely. I watched the realization dawn on them, not just that they could lose the penthouse, but that they could face financial ruin for trying to steal it. Evan finally spoke, his voice thin. "I did not think it would go this far. I just wanted to fix things for the wedding." My eyes met his. And you thought my life was the easiest thing to sacrifice." He looked down. Sandra slid the settlement document forward. "Sign here." It was not a question, it was a turning point. My father hesitated, breathing hard, anger radiating off him. But he was trapped. He knew it. He grabbed the pen, signed with a jerking motion, and shoved it toward my mother. She cried silently as she signed. Evan scribbled his name last, unable to look at me. Sandra gathered the documents, her expression calm and resolute. Then she stood. "This matter is now resolved. Any further interference will be met with immediate legal action." As we left the room, I did not look back. I did not need to. The power had shifted, and for the first time in my life, it shifted toward me. The consequences did not arrive in dramatic flashes or fiery confrontations. They came slowly, steadily, like the settling of dust after a collapse, revealing the shape of the wreckage my family had spent years pretending did not exist. The moment the settlement conference ended, my parents lost the power they had exercised over me my entire life. It did not vanish with a shout. It drained out of them silently the way light leaves a broken bulb. And for the first time, they were forced to confront the truth they had avoided for decades. They no longer had control. They no longer had leverage. They no longer had a daughter willing to sacrifice herself for their pride. After Sandra filed the formal withdrawal documents with the court making their surrender official, the fallout began. Word spread quietly through the extended family that the legal battle had gone badly for my parents. Of course, none of them knew the full story. My mother had not shared the details of the shove. My father had not admitted the legal lies. Evan had not confessed that he had planned to move into my penthouse as though it were already his. But they could not hide everything, not anymore. Relatives who once posted dramatic messages online about my supposed disrespect suddenly removed their comments. Others reached out privately asking what had really happened. I ignored them all. Their sudden curiosity was not repentance. It was embarrassment. They wanted to know the truth only because they had backed the wrong side. Meanwhile, my parents began living the consequences of the choices they had made long before the conference took place. The second mortgage they had taken to rescue Evan's lifestyle became a monthly weight they could no longer carry. With no access to my resources, they were forced to reckon with the financial ruin they had spent years denying. My father sold his truck first. It had been his pride, a symbol of the identity he clung to even as age and anger wore him down. Watching it leave the driveway must have felt like watching his last piece of dignity drive away. My mother sold her jewelry next. Not the real pieces, because she did not own many, but the sentimental ones she claimed were precious, even though their value was mostly emotional. She had always placed meaning in appearances, in showing others that we were a family worth admiring. Now she faced the truth she had avoided for too long. Appearances do not pay debts. Pride does not keep a roof over your head. Denial does not erase consequences. Months passed before my cousin finally told me what happened next. My parents tried to negotiate with the lender, but without collateral or consistent income, they had no leverage. They narrowly avoided foreclosure by selling a small rental property they had kept hidden from me for years. A property they had once insisted they could not afford to maintain, but had somehow always managed to collect income from. When the sale became public record, I understood fully the depth of their deceit. They had resources they never disclosed. They had money they never admitted to. Yet they had still tried to take what I built. My father's anger did not disappear with the legal defeat. It shifted. According to relatives, he blamed everyone except himself. He blamed me for being ungrateful. He blamed Sandra for manipulating me. He blamed the legal system for siding with facts instead of feelings. He blamed my mother for not raising me correctly. And eventually he blamed Evan. My brother did not escape the consequences either. When the truth about his financial instability came out during the settlement conference, Melissa's family reevaluated the engagement. They had already suspected he had been hiding things, but the official details shattered the last pieces of their trust. Within 3 weeks of the conference, the engagement was called off. Melissa did not tell Evan directly. Her mother delivered the message citing concerns about honesty, financial irresponsibility, and family instability. Instead of bringing pride to my parents, the wedding became the culmination of their downfall. The one event they believed would elevate them socially ended up revealing everything they had tried so desperately to hide. Evan moved back in with them for a short time, but even that became strained. My father's resentment grew each day, fueled by alcohol and humiliation. My mother's constant worrying became suffocating. The house felt smaller, the debts felt larger, and Evan's illusions of superiority crumbled under the weight of reality. Eventually, he left, taking a low-paying job 2 towns over the kind of job he used to mock me for working in my early 20s. He still has not spoken to me since the settlement, not even to apologize. But that silence feels more like relief than loss. I no longer carried responsibility for his failures. I no longer had to shrink so he could shine. I no longer had to dim myself to preserve the fragile ego of a brother who believed entitlement was a birthright. My parents' social circle changed too. Friends who had once admired their confident stories now avoided them. The details of the settlement were private, but rumors flowed quickly in communities like theirs. People sensed that something had gone wrong, something embarrassing, something humiliating. And my parents could not spin the story the way they used to. They grew quieter, more withdrawn, more bitter. For years, they had built their identities around the belief that they were the respectable ones, the hard-working ones, the proud ones who deserved admiration. Now they were confronted with a truth they could not rewrite. They had attempted to steal from their own daughter. They had nearly destroyed her, and they had failed. Meanwhile, I rebuilt my life with a sense of peace I had never known. The penthouse no longer felt haunted by the memory of the shove. I replaced the kitchen counter where my head had struck. I repainted the walls. I rearranged the furniture. I reclaimed the space physically and emotionally. My therapist once told me that healing does not always come from forgiveness. Sometimes healing comes from consequences. Seeing the people who harmed you finally face the truth of their actions. Watching the illusion of their power crumble, and realizing you no longer fear them. That was the fall of the old power, not a collapse, a release. Slow, steady, inevitable. For the first time in my life, I stood on ground they could not touch. Healing did not begin with forgiveness or reconciliation or some profound revelation about family. It began with something much smaller and far less glamorous. It began with breathing without flinching. It began with waking up without bracing myself for a crisis. It began with the sudden quiet that filled my penthouse once the chaos ended, and the shouting and threats and manipulation faded into memory instead of daily reality. I remember standing in my living room one morning, sunlight slicing through the tall windows, touching my face like something I had not felt in years. Safety. Not comfort, not ease, but safety. I exhaled a long breath that had been trapped inside me for decades. That was the moment I realized healing was not a single act. It was a series of choices, and I needed to start making them for myself. My first choice was therapy. I walked into Dr. Hawkins's office with a stiff jaw and tight shoulders, feeling half defensive and half ashamed for even being there. I told her that a grown woman should not need therapy just because her family was toxic. She looked at me with calm eyes and asked a simple question. Why should you endure what no one else would tolerate? I had no answer. She helped me unspool years of conditioning, years of believing my needs were inconveniences, my boundaries were selfishness. My accomplishments were accidental and my pain was exaggerated. Sessions were not comfortable. They cracked open memories I had spent years burying under work and obligation. But each time I left her office, I walked a little straighter. I spoke a little clearer. I reclaimed a piece of myself I did not know I had lost. My second choice was to reclaim my home. The penthouse had been a battlefield. I could still see the exact corner where my father shoved me. I could hear the echo of his anger in the tiles. I could feel the chill of betrayal every time I passed the kitchen. So I remodeled. Not to erase the past, but to overwrite the emotional weight embedded in the space. I replaced the countertop where my head struck. I changed the lighting. I painted the walls in warm tones that reminded me of sunrise and renewal. Every change I made was a declaration. They do not own this place. They do not own me. By the time the renovation ended, the penthouse felt alive again. It felt like mine. Not a fortress against my family, but a sanctuary for my future. My third choice was rebuilding my identity beyond survival. For years, I defined myself by what I endured, by how much strength I could muster, by how much I could carry on my shoulders. That was not identity. That was exhaustion disguised as resilience. So I returned to the things that once lit something inside me. I volunteered at a construction program for young women entering trades. I gave them what no one had given me at their age: encouragement, resources, a blueprint to build not just structures but lives. Some of them reminded me of myself, fierce but underestimated. Others reminded me of who I wished I could have been. One afternoon, a student named Rosa approached me with calloused hands and nervous eyes and said, "You make me believe I can do this." I swallowed the lump in my throat because for the first time I felt what generational change looked like. My pain was not going to be wasted if it fueled someone else's rise. My fourth choice was boundaries. Hard, final, necessary boundaries. My parents sent messages every few weeks. My father's were clipped and guilty in a way that felt more like inconvenience than remorse. My mother's were longer laced with excuses and phrases like, "We were under stress," and "You know your father's temper," and "Can't we just move past it?" Evan texted once a single line that read, "I need time." I never replied. I no longer felt responsible for their feelings, their finances, their reputation, or their consequences. Setting boundaries did not mean I hated them. It meant I stopped abandoning myself to save people who never once protected me. My fifth choice was community. I hosted dinners in the Penthouse, small gatherings with people who had stood by me or had shown me genuine respect. We cooked. We laughed. We filled the space with warmth instead of fear. My cousin attended the first dinner and hugged me with the kind of affection that felt unconditional. Sandra came to another gathering, settling easily into the group, her laugh echoing in a way that softened the edges of her usually sharp demeanor. She later told me she rarely connected deeply with clients, but something about my courage resonated with her. Courage. It took a long time to see myself that way, to understand that my survival was not weakness or shame. It was evidence of who I really was beneath the years of being minimized by the people who should have lifted me. And the more I leaned into my community, the more my life widened beyond trauma and confrontation. My sixth choice was permission. Permission to dream, permission to rest, permission to create a life not defined by what I escaped, but by what I chose to build. I started running again in the mornings, not to outrun stress, but to welcome clarity. I traveled to places I had postponed for years. I learned to cook. I learned to sleep without checking the door twice. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I became someone new. Or maybe I finally became who I always should have been. Healing is not linear. Some nights, old fears still whisper. Some days, I still flinch at sudden anger. But now, I know how to breathe through it, how to ground myself, how to remember the truth. I survived a family that demanded everything and offered nothing. I walked away from expectations that were never mine to carry. I reclaimed my life. The woman I became is not perfect. She is not unscarred, but she is free, and that freedom is worth every battle it took to earn it. Closure is a strange thing. People imagine it arrives with a dramatic conversation or a heartfelt apology or some cinematic moment where everything finally makes sense. But in my life, closure came quietly, almost unnoticed at first, and then all at once like a door easing shut, followed by a satisfying click. I did not find it in my parents' voices or my brother's regret. I found it in my own decision to stop walking toward people who refused to meet me halfway. After the settlement, the messages from my family slowed from daily to weekly to occasionally. My mother sent long texts filled with emotional pleas and fractured justifications that sounded like apologies until you read them twice. She said things like, "We were desperate," and "You know your father did not mean to hurt you, and families should forgive each other." Sometimes she added photos of old birthdays or holidays as if nostalgia could erase the bruise on my temple or the hollow thud of my skull hitting the counter. My father's texts were shorter, usually no more than a few words. He wrote, "We need to talk," or "Let's fix this," or "I did what I had to." Those last words confirmed everything I needed to know. He still believed forcing me to sign away my home was justified. He believed his pride mattered more than my bodily safety. He believed being a father meant ownership, not responsibility. The final blow was a voicemail he left one Sunday morning. His voice was thick with alcohol slurred around the edges, saying, "If you had just signed the damn papers, none of this would have happened." Not once did he say, "I am sorry." Not once did he acknowledge the shove. Not once did he mention me waking up alone in the ER. That voicemail sealed the door I had been slowly pulling closed. My therapist reminded me that closure is not reconciliation. Closure is accepting that some people will never give you what you deserve and choosing peace over longing anyway. So I made my choice. I stopped replying to messages filled with guilt disguised as affection. I muted group chats that pretended nothing had happened. I stopped reading posts from relatives who only loved the version of me that stayed quiet and compliant. I chose distance. I chose silence. And with every small boundary, the world felt less heavy. My cousin was the first person to notice the shift. She visited one evening with a bottle of sparkling cider and asked if I felt lonely pulling away from so much family. I told her the truth. I had never felt less alone, because loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of safety. And now that my life was full of people who respected me, supported me, believed me, and did not require me to shrink myself to keep them comfortable, loneliness felt like a past life. Meanwhile, my parents drifted farther into the consequences of their own making. They sold their rental property to pay the second mortgage. Their social circle shrank. Their reputation, once built on bravado and false stability, dissolved the way sand crumbles under rising tide. Evan found a job 2 towns over and moved into a small apartment. He never attempted another conversation with me beyond a single email that said, "I am sorry for everything. You did not deserve any of it." I read it 3 times. Then I wrote back the only sentence I felt was honest. "I accept your apology. I hope your new city treats you well." 10 words. Enough to close the chapter without reopening the wound. I did not need revenge to feel whole. The justice system had already affirmed my truth. The legal records had established the facts, and life had delivered consequences that matched their choices. What I needed was peace. And peace came not from punishing them further, but from building a life they could no longer influence or sabotage. 6 months after the settlement, I hosted a dinner with the small circle of people who had supported me during the worst months of my life. My cousin sat to my left, laughing as she told a story about her daughter's school play. My friend Mason brought dessert. Rosa, one of the young women from the construction program I mentored, dropped by with flowers. And Sandra, the lawyer who had fought for me with steady hands and sharper intellect than my parents ever expected, made a toast to resilience. We ate on the balcony under the soft glow of city lights, and as I listened to the easy conversation and warm laughter around me, I felt something I had not felt in years. Belonging. Not the fragile conditional belonging my family offered, where love was currency and loyalty was demanded without being earned. This was real, built on trust, built on honesty, built on mutual respect. When the evening ended and everyone left, I stood alone in the quiet of my penthouse looking out at the skyline. The city pulsed with movement and promise and possibility, and for the first time the view did not feel like something I needed to prove I deserved. It simply felt like home. My parents did reach out again months later, this time with a hesitant, almost formal message. "We would like to talk. We want to make things right." I stared at the words for a long time before realizing something important. Closure does not require the other person to change. It requires you to stop hoping they will. I did not respond. I did not block them either. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors you choose not to open. Not now, maybe not ever. I ended my story not with reconciliation, but with clarity. My family's love was conditional. Mine finally was not. And so I offered the same message to my viewers that I whispered to myself the first night I realized I was finally free. Sometimes choosing yourself is not betrayal. Sometimes it is survival. Sometimes it is the first honest act you ever perform. And sometimes it is the only way to build a future worth living in. So I ask you the same question I once asked myself when I stood in this rebuilt home and breathed without fear for the first time. Have you ever had to choose yourself over your family? If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for giving me your time, your attention, and your heart. Stories like this are not just entertainment. They are echoes of real struggles that so many people live through silently, especially those who grew up in families where loyalty was demanded but never returned, where boundaries were treated as disrespect, and where choosing yourself felt like breaking some unspoken law. If any part of this story resonated with your experience, I want you to know this truth. You are not alone, and what happened to you was not your fault. Life does not always give us the family we deserve, but it does give us moments where we can choose a new direction, where we can reclaim our worth, where we can finally say enough and mean it. And sometimes it takes hitting the floor, the ER, or rock bottom emotionally before we realize how strong we truly are. If you have ever walked away from people who refused to treat you with basic respect, if you have ever rebuilt your life piece by piece after being torn down by those who were supposed to protect you, or if you are only now discovering what boundaries even look like, I hope this story reminded you that survival is not weakness. It is courage. It is clarity. It is the beginning of a life that belongs to you and no one else. I would love to hear your voice in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Tell me if you have ever faced something similar. Tell me how you found your strength or how you are still searching for it. Your stories help others feel seen. They remind people who are suffering in silence that healing is possible at any age. If you enjoyed this and want more stories about truth justice, family dynamics, resilience, personal boundaries, and the hard decisions that shape our lives, make sure you hit that like button. It lets the algorithm know that these stories matter and helps them reach someone who might need them tonight. And if you want to join this community of people who are brave enough to confront their past and strong enough to build a better future, tap subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Each video here is crafted with care, emotional depth, and respect for everyone who has lived through the kind of pain no one ever talks about out loud. Thank you for being here, for standing with me, and for choosing your own peace one story at a time. Now I will leave you with one final question, the same one that changed everything for me. When the moment finally comes, will you choose them or will you choose yourself?